Well, welcome everybody. Pheng here, he, him, his, to our 52nd kitchen table conversation, a series of conversations about how we, as men and masculine folks, live healthy lives and navigate the complexities of current issues and events in our lives, and talking about those in ways that are um, meaningful to us and in ways that are challenging to us as well too. So I'll let my colleagues and brothers here share who they are before we go, as usual, into discussion about what we're going to talk about today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his, or in Spanish, él. And I work for Esperanza United, formerly Casa Esperanza, as the Engaging Men and Boy Program Specialist. Super excited to be here in this space with my three favorite people. I have them finally all together in this platform. So super happy to be here. Looking forward for this conversation.
And hey, everybody, I am Sean Hayes. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I work up in Duluth at Men as Peacemakers, and also just real excited to have our friend Ed back here today and to be together with all of you. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, it's so good to be with all of you. Hello, everybody. I'm Ed. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm here with Sean, Men as Peacemakers in Duluth, Minnesota.
Well, very cool. You know, we just had People's Indigenous Day last week and Indigenous Month as well too. And then we also had people who had probably gotten together and shared a meal with families and friends last week as well too. So there's that in terms of checking in to see how things went with the families and things like that. And then we also have, I think Felix, you had raised that this month is also awareness for men as well too, particularly for testicular cancer, raising awareness month and talking about how people are probably not shaving their mustaches. They're leaving it in to raise awareness around that, particularly for men, because I think it's important for men to really do checkups and do physical checkup as well as mental and emotional checkup. But we know that there's a lot of men who don't do that, and a lot of masculine identified people who don't go and take care of themselves in those ways. So there's that. And then, you know, we have the whole month of December here, and the year is about to be done. 2022 is almost over, and we're almost on the verge of 2023. Some of us may be in 2023 already. So there's a lot, and you know, there's a snow here and there, couple cold days that we had as well too. Um, yeah, so there's a whole tons of, I'm sure, as always, there's a lot of things that, and then that are happening in the environment that we're not probably paying attention to as well too. Um, but I think, as usual, the conversation goes the way that the conversation is. But I just wanted to mention those things because those are things that I know had happened in the last couple of weeks, or that are happening here in the next couple of weeks as well too. And then, you know, we talked at one point, I think between me and Sean, the election had just finished for about a month now as well too, and people are probably resting from that, and others are getting ready for another election cycle. And while some folks are um, having to rest a longer period of time before the next election cycle in their states as well too. So there's all of those things that has happened, and I know that, you know, to Felix and Sean's point there, this is Ed's first time, quote unquote, with us via this platform, and it's been a couple of months since he's been with us. So good to have him back here and be sharing space with him as well too, because we did actually see each other during our retreat about a month ago now. So that was really nice as well too, that we didn't talk about too much in this space yet. So there's all those things as well that have taken shape and has happened as well too, that I just wanted to throw out there and see what catches as usual.
Thank you, Peng. By the way, I wasn't part of that retreat. I couldn't make it just because of work commitment, but I'm looking forward, hopefully next year, to participate and be part of it. I'll probably need to do more planning ahead of time, but yes, thank you for sharing about Movember. Obviously, Movember is a annual celebration where men let the mustache grow during the month of November to create awareness about mental health issues. So something that's super important. And like you mentioned, men don't like to take care of ourselves. Best example is me. You know, my wife is the one who's always pushing me to do my annual check, and to do my doctor's appointment and my dentist appointments. And I always say, I'll do it later, I'll do it later. And she's the one who's always pushing me. So I'm lucky to have a spouse that, she's always ahead and on that. But yeah, I think talking about the retreat, that's something that you mentioned, and last week, with obviously taking their time to have a better understanding why we shouldn't celebrate Thanksgiving. That's the conversation that we had in our family, in our side, and especially me coming from Puerto Rico, Latin America, and we're there indigenous communities that are the Tainos. They're pretty much non-existent. They're really, really small groups. And when you start thinking about, what's left of that, when we think about our culture and important to embrace where we're from, and I can still see some small remembrances of the Tainos in some of the language, and the hammocks is something I really enjoy. The hammocks, and the hammocks is something that it comes from that. Even the name in Spanish is called hamaca. There's a hammock, and it's an indigenous word, so from the Taino. So through food, and there's a lot of other ways we can continue those traditions, and something that's super, super important to us to remember and to create awareness of it. So, but I'm really intrigued to hear a little bit more about the retreat, just because as men, and like we're talking about November that happened last month, the importance of taking care of ourselves and creating these spaces for men is something that's super, super essential, super necessary. If you could say it that way. And one of the reasons why I love to do men groups and youth groups is to create that safe space where we have that opportunity to talk about those topics that are important to us, those topics that sometimes we don't talk just because we think that we're going to look weak if we talk about those things related to health and self-care, and the importance of taking care of ourselves, doing yoga, meditation, and some of those non-traditional things that men don't do just because they're not men-like. So I would love to hear a little bit about that, if you guys don't mind. I know we're pretty open to talk a lot about a lot of things, but to share, hopefully you guys can share a little bit of what you guys did, and hopefully maybe inspire other individuals that are listening to this podcast to say, you know what, I want to do that with my friends. I want to take a weekend off and have a conversation about where we go every single day, so we can create stronger support systems where we can start breaking those unhealthy habits, those gender roles that cause so much harm. So I leave it there, and hit back and to hear a little bit from you guys about this. So yeah, if you guys have anything else to share, feel free to do it too. So thank you.
I just want to say that I think that the taking care of ourselves is so vitally important, especially during this time of the year, right? Where it's easy to get caught up with the end of the year stuff, and then there's like tons of things that I'm juggling in my life, or that we're all as men and masculine folks trying to juggle: family relationships, gatherings, trying to celebrate the end of the year, and we can forget easily that those things can be very stressful as well, right? There's like no good or bad stress, I always say to people, but there's just stress. It depends on what value you put to it and attach to it. But these things that could be very joyful are very stressful as well too. And I think it's so important to take time out to just like reflect and decompress and have time to ourselves or time with other people in space. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we often design these spaces, the retreats that we do, is for that, to have one or two really deep conversations. And then the rest of the time is really to just be in space with one another, take care of ourselves and take care of community, right? And it looks like there's just a bunch of guys hanging out. And how is that different than any other guys hang out? But there's like intentionality that's crafted in it, the same way that we craft these conversations with intentionality of it being very, very organic, being like on the fly, quote unquote. And it feels like we had talked about that a couple of weeks ago about like it feels like there's no point to these conversations, but there's actually a point and a purpose to it because it is designed intentionally to be done in a way where we as men and masculine folks have not done these kinds of conversations for ourselves. We're designing the spaces. And so I think in the design, it is really important to name that even for our retreat spaces that we were talking about here, coming together and building community, it's important to design a space where people can actually come with their whole selves and come without having to like do a lot of head prep work, right? Oftentimes, I think we go to conferences or meetings or symposiums or whatever you call or it's called. These meeting spaces are called. We go in there with our own agenda, which is oftentimes from our head, right? And the way that we are trying to practice, I think in this space, very so much so too, is that we want men and masculine folks to be showing up with their gut, their spirits, their bodies, and their hearts, not just their heads only, right? Not just all day long analyzing, because we can analyze all day long and we can give understanding all day long and do education all day long. But is that really going to free up the ways in which we move in our lives? Is that going to um, transform into behavior change in our life, right? Is that going to allow us that spaciousness that we yearn for to just be, right? And I think so much of that is understanding that, as Jackson Katz puts it, and I think a cult to men puts it, is that men often put on a facade or live in a box or have a mask on. And what we're trying to design in these spaces, even in the retreat spaces, take off your mask, come as you are, leave your mask at the door. You can pick it up on the way home if you want to, but in this space, you leave it, you know, or you could leave it in the space and not pick it up ever again. And I think that's why that taking care of not only ourselves is really important, but socially and emotionally of other people and of the people we are in relationship with is vitally important to our own self-care too, right? I think when we live in such an individualistic society, we think about taking care of ourselves as I just need to go disappear for a little bit, go on these. I was having a conversation with my friends a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, people who go on these like, I'm gonna go find myself journeys, and let me go and work on myself here. And I would say like 80%, 90% of these people who do that come back, and it's like, did you really find yourself? And did you really work on yourself? And it was like, and I don't want to minimize that those things aren't helpful. They are, but the thing is that you have to do the work. You have to do the work, right? It isn't just about like this journey of like, let me go on this hike, or let me go to Jamaica, or let me go to South America or whatever, and climb Mount Everest or whatever, and achieve an epiphany, but like, in order to achieve that epiphany, you have to do the work. That's like the internal work, the emotional work, the deep self-awareness work, like the deep learning kinds of journeys that we all do and we have to do every day. And I would say, like I said, my estimate from it would be that majority of people who come back and they're like, they feel refreshed, and it's like they found something, but they really don't have clarity around it as well too, right? Because part of the processing that we need to do in the taking care of each other and one another is we have to be able to take that time to process with others as well too, right? To gain a deeper sense of understanding for ourselves of who we are. It isn't just about me doing it in my head all day long. We are already doing that. Nobody needs to go on these journeys to do that kind of processing because you're doing that already in your head every day. So like be more intentional, I think, in caring and the taking care of one another and ourselves, I would say, um, and be very thoughtful about how we would do it. It's not an easy thing of like, let me just go and do a meditation for like 3 months and then I'll come back out of that and I'll be like, I figured out myself, in my life story or whatever. You might, but the figuring out yourself and the working on yourself and taking care of you and community requires much more responsibility than just that 3 month off or 3 years off or whatever time that you're taking away to do that, find your journey self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you're talking, Pheng and Felix, as you mentioned the retreat, it just makes me think about what we have learned over time about what it means to create relationships that help make us all stronger. And as I think everybody has said so far, the holidays, this period of time, is often a time when different types of relationships are so much, on and at the table, kind of literally. And so, for me, a big part of it is trying to be in relationships in ways where the ways that I'm in those relationships are hopefully in some way, shape, or form nourishing and good for other people, and also for myself. And that can mean, various depths, frequency of contact, like all sorts of stuff like that are dictated by our conditions and our time and the things that we need from one another and all of that kind of stuff. But I think that there's value in just being aware of and thinking about and being in conversation around how we think about our relationships and the way that relationships are what drive and power a community and its ability to hold, the wellness and the well-being of everyone in that community. So one of my favorite things about the retreat, we did all sorts of cool things, Felix, and maybe folks, maybe we'll talk in some more depth, but I mean, we had like great conversations around feminism and queer politics, and we did some exploration of spirit and what's at our essence and all of that kind of stuff. But one of my favorite things that we did was we made meatloaf, and it was like one of the highlights of that whole period of time, actually, because it was an example. Pheng and Sean had done a lot of work to get groceries and food and stuff that would support and nourish people. And there was a point at time in it when it was sort of, we were getting to the point where we were going to decide what we were going to have for a dinner. And Sean sort of explained what we had and what the options were, and if anybody had any requests or things that they wanted. And one of our folks, said, well, if nobody else has anything, I'd really like some meatloaf, because meatloaf was something that made him think about home. He hadn't had it for a long time. It was something that that mattered in the moment to him. And what happened was that, there was a trip to the grocery store that was gonna happen. So the right ingredients were brought, the appropriate recipes were found on Google. Everybody was around the counter doing various parts of the seasoning and the chopping and the cooking and the cleanup from that thing. And it was just an example of what happens when you're in that type of space that's purposefully constructed, as Pheng said, but allows for people to share a part of what's maybe going on both in their heart and in their spirit and in their body. We're hungry and hungry for home and for the connection and for the memories that has, and the way that a small group of men can like come together then and actually put the pieces together to do that and then enjoy that meal together. And that makes me smile every time I think about it. I when people asked what we did, I basically said we made meatloaf for the first. That was my first part of the answer to that question. I think that there's a lot to learn in what creates the conditions where that kind of thing can happen.
I answer pretty much the same way. We made meatloaf. That was definitely a highlight. And to clarify, I believe the recipe was even from one of the other folks who was there too, from a friend of his. And so I think for me, and hearing what Pheng and Ed shared about the time, I definitely echo a lot of that. And I think for me, just the experience of being together in a way that isn't super regimented, that where there is that intention around rest, there is that intention around connection. And I think, even in the meatloaf scenario, for me, I remember experiencing that as like, this is the first time I've ever made meatloaf. And like, how do you do this? And like, so it was just really like a combined, like beautiful time together, I think, in that like we're teaching each other, we're showing, I think at one point like I was mixing with my hands and my hands were like frozen, and I think then Serrano came in and took over, and we had Pheng stir frying veggies, and just that sort of togetherness feels really good. And and also I think at times too, like I think that there are moments where I feel a little awkward too, because it's like we just don't have a lot of these spaces. Someone, I can't remember who, mentioned, like a lot of the times when men in mask folks talk about, well, we need to care for ourselves, it usually looks like going away and like it looks like isolating. I was thinking about that for myself as well. Like I think it was just over this past weekend that I had sort of had a mini tantrum in response to my toddler's tantrum. And Amy at one point had said, "What do you need?" And it was like the only thing that came to mind that seemed like it would be a relief at that time was to just go for a drive and just to be by myself and like to listen to a podcast or whatever it is. I ended up driving up the North Shore, and I think going by the water usually helps me. But, that is sort of how I learned about caring for myself, is like we do that on our own. We do it in isolation. And so to come together, to do it, and then to be learning these new things about each other and like deepening the relationships, the trust that is there, feels really, really powerful and beautiful and good, and like something I want to keep doing. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like it's work. It's just guys coming together to care for each other and one another. And I would say probably one of the other moments that I chuckle a lot about is I think it was the same meatloaf night that I think it was Pheng and Ed and myself having a lengthy conversation about mice and things getting into our houses and how we all deal with that. And at one point, I think Ed had maybe said, "Oh yeah, I jump up and I scream or something." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I do the same thing," and that's like the opposite, right? Of like manly, we should be brave, take care of these, things. I will scream. I will scream. I hop up on the couch. I don't want it to run over my toes. I don't know what that is, but it was hilarious. So just like simple things like that. I don't even know how that came up. I do not remember, but it was amazing. And I just remember feeling like so good and connected and like hey, there's other folks who, are similar to me, the connections, and then hearing the differences too. So that will certainly remain a highlight for me as well. But yeah, just deeply grateful for the opportunity, to gather together.
Hey, that's funny. This wasn't planned, but this morning I was putting some mice traps in my garage just because a couple of days ago when I opened the garage, I saw some movement. And obviously here in Minnesota, once the winter start, they start to come in from wherever they are to look for a warm place to stay. And it looked like my garage was that place this year. So I this morning put 4 traps in the house. I don't know if they're gonna work or not. I'll give you an update, probably one of the future kitchen table conversations. But it was super nice to hear, you guys talking about the retreat. Like I mentioned before, that retreat that the Men and Masculine Folks Network made, I think it was in 2016 or 17. That was when you guys invited me for the first time. It was what it changed my life, and it made me do what I do today. It inspired me. And when I say in the beginning of this conversation, I have my 3 favorite people. Of course, I think you guys changed my life, changed my perspective, and I'm deeply grateful. And I have a commitment now for the rest of my life to continue creating these spaces, and hopefully, inspire others to do the same, because the impact is huge. And when you talk about a retreat, a lot of people think, oh, there's a bunch of guys drinking and talking. And when you guys share those experiences about meatloaf and how fun it was, and how good it was to put that mask away and be yourself, and share those things that sometimes scare us, like mice, that's, of course, if one run to you, there's no man in this world that would not jump or run away, because, even that they're small and they're probably not gonna cause us any harm, we will jump. But at the same time, sorry, pardon me, when you guys start talking about the meatloaf, I remember one of the retreats that I went, I made some arepas. Arepas is just a traditional dish from Venezuela, something that the natives from Venezuela used to make too. And it was fun, something that was super scared. I remember talking to my spouse, said, you need to teach me how to make this. I need to impress the guys. I need to learn how to do this. And I think I did all right. At least you guys survived. You guys still alive. You guys haven't asked for arepas again, though that's probably a little bit disappointing, but at least you guys survived. so that was good. And I think when we're open and we're, open to learn and have this type of conversation, there's so much positivity. There's a lot of healing on us, and it helps us become better individuals. So I'm super happy, and I just laugh. Even that wasn't there. Just imagine myself seeing you guys all together working, trying to create this dish is something that it bring a lot of happiness to me, even that I wasn't there. But hopefully, this is something that, like I mentioned before, individuals or families or friends can start doing together, go camping, and maybe something that we should do more often, not necessarily wait till once a year to do, and maybe just during the summer say, you know what, let's go camping. Let's get all stuff together, get your family, get your friends or whatever, and let's do it. Because I think when you're surrounded by people like that, you get so much, you feel supported, and that's the same support that we want to see in our communities. That's the same feeling that I want others to have, like the same feeling that I have in that first retreat when I was super scared, when for first time I had to open up and be vulnerable and talk about those things that I always knew, but I was afraid to talk, just because it was an expectation for men to talk about these topics. So hopefully, people that are interested or want to learn more, and they say, you know what, I want to do it, I need help, just contact us, let us know. Use Facebook, send us a message. I mean, we'll be more than happy to bring you tools, a lot of things that you can use in those spaces, so you can start having these conversations. And like I mentioned before, we're not perfect. I mean, we all learning, and we're in this process to become better individuals. But I think when we make that first step and we realize how easy it is, I think it's going to be something that's going to be a norm in the future, that everybody start having these conversations, talk about the importance of taking care of ourselves and others, and creating these communities that are free of violence, and everybody feels supported and everybody's treated equal. So yes.
Yeah, I think that that's so true. Um, yeah, I think the sharing of meals is so vitally important to sharing who we are and the creation of it. So even though I think to Sean Ed's point of it is that even though the recipe was gotten from somewhere else or shared from another person, it's the co-creation of it, right? Like the creating of it together and the um, how do we do it together and who's going to do what part is really important. And it wasn't just like the sitting back and folks are one or two people are like sitting having a side conversation somewhere and the rest of the folks are creating it together only, but it actually takes a community, and it is a community effort to actually be able to put it all together and hold. But it's essentially, I think the nut or the gem there that I want to be pointing out is um, the energy, the energy that is not oftentimes tangible or visible for us to see, that energy that we put out for each other and for one another in that creation of that meatloaf is so vitally important, or in that meal by itself, right? um, and I think that's where the learnings are, and that's where the creation happens, or where the practices are happening in building community. We don't often think about it that way, right? If we're just saying and we're looking from afar, that retreat would look like any other guy's quote unquote gathering, right? Um, but because we've been quite intentional over the last few years, and I think many of you have helped design some, and I know Ed and I have designed a lot in our own ways as well too, and together we've understood like how to build spaces and how to design spaces where men and masculine folks can come together, right, and be together in a way that's totally different than the ways and the experiences that they have had previous. So to your point, for sure, Felix, is that and I think that first time you came was the first time Sean came as well too, because that was our first retreat together in that way. And it may, it may have felt like, or it may appear on paper like any other retreat or work retreat that you were going to, but for sure, the essence and the depth of what the two of you have experienced there in the experiential piece of it cannot be replicated, right? Cannot be replicated because it's not in the mechanics of it. It is actually in the art form of it. And I think that that's why um, going to a retreat or whatever, we really have to really put a lot of energy into it, and a lot of emotional laboring and intensive spiritual laboring in designing it and in holding it, and the energy that gets put into the space and gets held in the space and gets lifted up in the space is so vitally important to that experience, right? That becomes such an experiential experience that it could only be, um, and that it can't be replicated. The content itself can be, the conversations in terms of the topics can be replicated, but essentially, if you create the context and the environment, to Ed's point earlier, the conditions enough differently, even though we may have the same conversations, meaning the same topic conversations, it's going to be different each and every time. And I think that that's the hope with our kitchen table conversations always, is that even though we may be talking about the same issues over and over again, that it's actually a different kind of an experience when you are participating with us and engaging with us in this hour and or listening to this conversation with us is that you get a different experience, right? Because it is such an experiential piece, and we've learned that that is so vital and so important to building relationship and community, and for us as men and masculine folks to actually practice new ways of being healthy and new ways of being masculine, or redefining what it means to be a man in this world, right? In ways that are different than what we've been socialized to think, or ways in which we've been socialized to do, right? And to enforce on one another. So I just wanted to lift up that gem because it is such an experiential thing that we're doing. It's not something where it can be taught easily, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, Pheng, about like it's not so much about the mechanics, but the art form of the relationships um, and the energy and these intangible things. And I just I bet you that we all would have different things to say about how you create conditions for the art of people's relationships to emerge, or for the beauty and the goodness and the less tangible stuff to come out of any individual, whether you're thinking about little kids in our lives, or whether we're thinking about our best buddies, or the elders in our lives, or our partners, like how you create the conditions for those more essential elements to emerge, because it does make a big difference. And that's what we're talking about. I mean, it's funny, meatloaf is actually a pretty controversial food item out there. I mean, it has like a fan club, and it also has a lot of haters and detractors, I think. And there are many different types of recipes for meatloaf as well, and different taste groups. I mean, there were points in time when different spices were going into the meatloaf, and I was thinking, well, but I was like interested in trying it, and I guess to your point, like it was fun to make that meatloaf. And one of the things that I remember is that I think a critical mass of folks came into that retreat feeling pretty tired. Like there's a lot going on in people's lives. There hadn't been a whole lot of sleep going on. Like, Pheng does an amazing job of creating these spaces where people can actually get rest at the same time. But by the time we were making that meatloaf, I mean, you know what it feels like when you come home at 7 o'clock at night and you got to figure out how to make a dinner for yourself alone or something, right? Like that can be a pretty, like one of these experiences where your whole body just sort of goes, oh, I have to figure out how to make dinner, right? Because you're tired and it's just another thing to do, right? But in this case, we were in a place where we needed rest, but because everybody brought like their own excitement, their own energy, their own part of making the meatloaf into the equation, it was like an experience where I had more energy in the end than I had when I started, because it was so fun to see the whole thing come together. And I think just when we like it's funny to talk about meatloaf so much in this way, but when we think about community as a whole, like I spent the last couple of weeks, I got to spend some time with my grandma, who's 92 years old. In order for her to be 92 years old and in her home, there's a whole community of people figuring out what needs to happen in order for that to work. And they have to communicate about the mechanics, the transactions that need to happen to make sure that the right medication is in place and that this thing is taken care of and that thing in this appointment and all that kind of stuff. And there's a way in which that could be crushing to the community of people that are doing it. But through relationship, there's an ability to talk about the mechanics in a way that, by and large, works for all of the different folks. And then there's the part where when those folks come together and when the phone calls happen, there's laughter and there's joking and there's that energy and that intangible stuff that makes for the conditions where a community can come together and actually become stronger and closer and more loving, because they're taking on the task at hand. And so I think like it's easier to describe what we're going for and sort of maybe try to tell some stories that help people think about the ways that you experience that in your own life. But I really think that Pheng got to the center of a part of what that is, when it is that like it can be, we can get so busy, and as men and masculine folks, like I still spend a lot of time going into a situation and thinking to myself, where do I fit in this situation? Where am I in the pecking order? Should I speak up or shouldn't I speak up? Like, what should my face look like? That kind of thing. Like I spend a lot of time worrying about like the mechanics of where I should be, where I am in the sort of transactional aspect of that relationship. But people, the three friends on this call know me as a pretty goofy fellow, for instance, and I noticed that you all create lots of opportunity for that to emerge. and for it to be a part of what helps like lift people up. And when you think about our small community of people, and we have people who know how to find the details and like make sure that the things that are detail oriented need to get done. We have people who are really task oriented in terms of like, here's some stuff that we want to cover and we want to get done, and here's a little bit of like starting knowledge, starting information. We have people who tend to space and to cleanliness and to getting things done, who are kind of behind the scenes folks. We have people who are storytellers, and people who bring a lot of spirit, and people who organize people when something needs to happen. And some of that stuff fits with our like paid jobs or the roles that we have in community. But there's a big part of it that is that art, that is like, how do we find out these things about who people, the gifts that people have, the goodness that people bring in a less tangible way? You have to let that emerge. And I'm starting to understand, if not be able to practice real well for myself, like I'm starting to understand that that's what creates for like a good life and a lot of possibility of health and well-being for everybody, including men and masculine folks. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Felix, you bringing up that first retreat, and I think so much of what Pheng and Ed are sharing are about like, how do we create those conditions for us to actually be able to just be without like sort of expectations on how we should be, and where we can actually feel that sense of belonging. I mean, I remember preparing to go to that first retreat, and I think I had maybe not even quite started at Men as Peacemakers yet. And so I was very nervous. And it was also the first all, men and masculine folks space that I had ever been in. I was early on in my transition. And so I was kind of like, am I going to fit in this space, or like, how weird am I going to feel? And, kind of going into it with those sort of worries. And I think to both of their credits, Pheng and Ed, and some other folks in that space really did like as Felix said, like that felt like a pretty life-changing experience for me, to be able to walk into a space where I felt like, hey, the fullness that I know of myself in this moment is actually all welcome here. We see you, we see and hear and want to hear about the different experiences, and yeah, it's just like this huge growth opportunity, and just, I don't know, for me, thinking back, it just feels like this is just another example that I got to experience of like what true community is supposed to feel like. And I think what communities felt like all the time, pre-colonization and violence and enslavement of peoples. And so it's like those glimpses give me hope, like sort of help me reground, and almost are like a reset for me too. It's like, oh, I have some time, we're not like agenda'd out every hour of every day that we're together. There's spaciousness, which I think we just so oftentimes don't get to have. And so, yeah, it's like, wow, it really feels different when you are intentionally trying to take care of yourself as well as others. And then like the work and the conversations and the healing that can happen just feels like exponentially bigger, like more is possible. Like I'm not alone in this world. There's a bunch of us here who love and care about, you know, very similar values, even if we have different experiences. And it's, yeah, it's a pretty powerful, beautiful thing that I feel very grateful to have sort of stumbled into. And then now to be a part of learning how to create spaces for more folks, you know, being able to sort of pass on what we learn and be a part of making more spaces like that where folks feel that deep sense of belonging and inclusion as well as safety.
I think it just takes a lot of work. It is not easy to do because what we're trying to do is, as for those who've listened to us for a long time or followed us on the kitchen table conversations, is that we need a lot of heart energy, a lot of spirit energy, a lot of gut energy, and a lot of body energy to show up, right? Because it's so easy for men and masculine folks to show up in their head, right? And to be there and to be like, to Ed's point, right sizing his position every moment and every conversation and think about how to do that. And obviously, it's taken years for us to get to a place where we are with one another, right? But each experience that we have or each opportunity that we have allows us to further cultivate that connection, right? And further cultivate how, when conflicts show up in our lives, how we maneuver it and how we navigate it together, right? And I always think about it as um, how do we cultivate these opportunities in these moments much more, that we can be much more connected in community and in our relationships, so that when conflicts arise, we know how to navigate it in healthy ways, and that conflict doesn't separate us, right? Because so often it's the difference or it's the conflicts or the not understanding that allows us to actually disconnect, and the more opportunities that we have to connect. And I think that that's why the value of connection for us in this space and in every space we hold is so important, is because it allows us to ensure that there's some cushion or some safety net of maneuvering and navigating conflicts when it arises, and the differences or the misunderstandings or the not understandings, right? Of us being able to maneuver and keep trusting that process, or keep entrusting ourselves to the happenings of the world or the conditions of what's happening, um, and and that conflict part of it. But essentially, what that means is that each one of us has to give something up and put in something, right? Um, as much as we can create the conditions and things like that, like people have to be willing to do the work. Like I said earlier, if you aren't doing the internal work, you're going to be going every year, you're going to be going on a find myself journey, and you'll have no clarity and no self-awareness on that at all, right? Because you haven't done the internal work, and that deep self-knowledge and self-awareness, and self like goals and purpose and understanding, that that's the deep internal work that I'm talking about, right? And we can read all the self-help books we can go to all the therapy sessions that we want to, we can get all the coaching that we want to, but if you aren't doing the work, right, in between those sessions, it's not going to happen. Like that work isn't going to happen, right? So even though we create those spaces for the conditions to happen, like the in-between spaces of when we meet with one another and afterwards is the critical moments of how we deepen that learning and that connection and community. It isn't just only when we are together that relationship building and connection is happening, but it is the in-between times that we do that work and carry that work that allows for some cohesion, the continuation of that cohesion and the sustainment of those relationships, right? Because if we only build relationships when we're together only, then it'll be too far between one another, right? So there has to be something done in between. And how do you bridge the in-betweenness of it is the work that we all must do individually until we are back in community again to continue the work in community, right? So that's like the taking care of ourselves is so important that way, that in this conversation, I think that I really want to highlight is as we take care of ourselves and our communities in the next couple of weeks and as the year closes, and we set ourselves and people set new aspirations for the new year. Really think about that connection part that we're talking about here, right? Really think about what that means in your lives and in our lives and in the relationships that you hold with other people and the emotional energy that you have to actually put out, the social energy that you have to actually put out and put in to actually make those connections work and make those social relationships moving and sustainable for yourself and for others, and being in community in ways that you may have not been in, right? And I think that that's our hope always in this platform is for folks who are engaging with us and listening to this conversation to do that and to think about those things. So I really just wanted to highlight that. And it's always a good reminder for me of like what it means to be a community. Exactly to Ed's point earlier is that the more that we can care for one another in those ways, then people can really show up the way that they need to and really shine as well too. So that's just my closing thoughts on this part of it, but I appreciate it.
Lost my mouse here, but I found it here. Yes, it's amazing to listen to you guys. I get personally my energy recharge and inspire, and I always get tools and learn new things. And maybe I need to learn how to make meatloaf. I love meatloaf, and listen to you guys and realizing how we're have sharing this experience and understanding that it's an expectation on women to do breakfast, lunch and dinner, and we're just like joking about, making meatloaf one day. It remind me, it's like, this is why I do what I do. I think we need to start changing those stereotypes. I think times in the past used to be different, probably for most of us in the 30s and 40s. I'm more in the 40s, mid 40s, but to create that change of, what, we cannot expect, the women in our life to cook and do these dishes for us when, us men were sitting on the couch, or doing other things. And that's the type of example that I try to do every day in my home with my daughters. And even if I don't know how to cook, I make sandwiches, I do burgers, I do hot dogs, I do everything I can, arepas, just to be sure my daughters understand that it's not their responsibility to cook. But at the same time, when you learn to cook and you can start learning these new dishes, it's a moment for the whole family to be together and cook and do create these dishes that come from our grandmothers, great grandmothers. So there's a lot of learning there, and it can bring so much, to don't lose those important traditions that we have in our lives. But that's not taking credit of all the information that Pheng just shared right now, the importance of these spaces, the important to be the best version of ourselves, and at the same time to realize that we all have something to bring to these spaces. We all have a gift that we can utilize to be better allies, to be better brothers, better fathers, better everything. And these opportunities are the ones that we need to come with our heart, so we can get the best of it and we can have a better understanding of the space of the moment, so we can be better men and masculine folks. And that this is possible thanks to spaces like this, spaces to conversation like the one we're having right now, that they're so important, and sometimes we're so busy with work, so busy with what we're going through, that we forget to have these conversations, that we stay or keep being guided by these expectations of the society, that they're patriarchal and they continue causing harm, and just because we're men, sometimes we say, you know what, I stay quiet. It's easier for me to stay in bed while my wife make breakfast, and when in reality, it's my duty, it's my role as a husband, as a partner, to be there and support my wife. And she wake up, be with her, and bake breakfast with her, wash the dishes, do all that kind of stuff that sometimes as men we forget. I know the newer generations, they're being exposed more to be more engaged and break with this gender stereotype and gender roles, but at least for men like me, a 47-year-old man, I mean, still hard sometimes to break those roles just because I'm so used to it. And now as a father, of course, I do everything I can to break with those. So thank you, all of you guys, for sharing your experiences, for the people listen in this podcast, to taking your time to listen to us. And please, you contact us, let us know how we can support your groups, how we can support you. Send us an email, send us a, look for, let us know how we can support you better. And thank you, all of you, to Sean, Ed, and Pheng, for being such amazing role models and be who you are. So I really appreciate it.
Likewise.
Yeah, ditto. Back at all of you. Well, I feel like this is a great time for us to wrap up, and I know our time is coming to an end here for today's conversation. So thank you to each of you. I know I am deeply changed and continuing to change because of all of you, for the better, for, my better, for my family's better, in our community, so grateful for each of you. And we're also really grateful for you for watching, for tuning in, and for joining our conversations. We're very grateful to our funding partners as well, who are Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota and the Novo Foundation, for all of their continued support. And as a reminder, we are holding these conversations every 2 weeks on Thursdays at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can join us next time on Thursday, December 15th at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. And don't forget, we love to hear from you during those conversations. If you have questions and comments and memories, things that come up, we'd love to see your comments, and we'd love to bring those into our conversations. So we're grateful for each of our viewers. You are our community as well. And so we hope that you all take good care. Have a great next 2 weeks, and we'll be back on the 15th. Take care.